nuts and bolts of what you do when you're focused with some of these issues. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather White, and I'm an attorney at Snow Christensen and Martineau, and I have Scott Young with me. I'll let Scott introduce himself, but Scott and I have been doing civil rights litigation for many years. I've been doing it for 22 years, and Scott's not much far behind me. And we have had First Amendment cases and issues arise, and we want to be able to help you navigate through these areas. So if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to interrupt. We would love to have this be more interactive too, if you like, and we can answer certain questions. Sometimes the answers to questions are very fact specific, and we might need to say we don't know the answer to that, but we can look at it and come back with an answer later. So we'll try to do that. So with that, I'll let Scott introduce himself, and we'll get going on our presentation.
Hi, Scott Young. I know many of you, and like Heather said, for my entire career, Heather and I both clerked for Judge D and got a good glimpse of what goes on behind the robe, so to speak, and have used that hopefully to the advantage of all of you and our other clients as we've practiced in this civil rights area. So with that, we'll get going if that's okay. Assuming I can get this to work.
We're going to share our screen. We've got a PowerPoint that we'd like to be able to use if we possibly can.
And we can see your screen, Heather.
Yeah,
you can see it great.
Not sure what
I apologize for not getting the introduction done. You've done a great job introducing yourself, and I had intention of doing that, but great job. We've got we can see your screen, so you should be great to go.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
Great. So I'm going to start off and talk a little bit about the First Amendment and the history, specifically with freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and then Heather's going to get into some of the nuts and bolts and the law, the legal framework that we're all operating in as we confront protests and gatherings in this kind of brave new world that we're in. And then I'm going to come back at the end and talk about some best practices and things that we're looking at with our new circumstances. So you can see up on the screen, I've got the First Amendment quoted, as well as this flag of the First Amendment. And I'm not going to read it to you, but I do want to show you a little video that is a quick summary of the First Amendment. Whoops. Assuming. So if that felt like you were going back to third grade, that's because I've spent the morning trying to get my sixth grader, third grader, and kindergartner going on Zoom. So it was just apropos, so to speak. What I think is interesting about this, the First Amendment in particular, is it really embodies what we would call the core principles that everyone thinks of when they think of what does it mean to be an American. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, freedom of religion, I couldn't tell you, and I practice in civil rights area, what the 17th Amendment is right now. But if you ask anyone, you walk out on the street, you leave your office for 5 minutes and ask them about the First Amendment, they're going to have an opinion on it. And what I think where this centers on what we all do is in municipalities is that it's a really emotional topic for people. People have strong convictions about the First Amendment, even if they don't understand the law behind it, even if they don't even understand everything that's included in it. And I think we have to keep that in mind, because we're dealing just by nature, even without what's gone on in the last few months, with a hot button topics. So freedom of assembly and freedom to petition the government are critical parts of the First Amendment. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is a confluence of really critical factors that are impacting people's First Amendment rights, and for municipalities, how we allow citizens, members of our community, to utilize those rights. And those include COVID and public health impact of assembly, protests and demonstrations, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, and of course, social media, which seems to be impacting every aspect of our life. And we're going to talk about these in detail and in context of the legal framework of the First Amendment.
And I think we want to just sort of let you know too what we're not going to talk about, and that is freedom of employees to express themselves within the workplace. That is an entirely different body of law that has so many different regulations and nuances to it. So what you'll be hearing from us does not apply to that. It applies really to these open and public forums, not private property. The First Amendment does not apply to private property owners or even in the government employment context.
So with that, I want to just walk through a couple of the seminal, or a few of the seminal cases that have led up to this moment in First Amendment jurisprudence. And again, we're specifically talking about freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, because they kind of get joined here late in about the 1980s. But this first case, United States versus Cruikshank, what I think is the most important thing to understand from this case is the year that it came out, 1875. So the Civil War ends in 1865 and then becomes the period of Reconstruction. And what we see is that this concept of First Amendment assembly didn't really even take root for 100 years. And you see in my bullet point there, what went on during those 100 years? Well, War of 1812, the Civil War, slavery. I mean, there were a number of things to protest, but one thing that we didn't have, or a couple things that we didn't have that we do have today, is the means to organize, the means to gather together in the same way. And I don't know if that's why it took so long to have kind of a seminal case on this topic, but it was nearly 100 years. And the basis of this case was that there was a law that prohibited certain assembly for workers in kind of a union context. And the Supreme Court held that private citizens couldn't be prosecuted for a denial of the First Amendment freedom of assembly. Now, it was kind of a broad holding, and it left a lot of room for interpretation. And this next case, Whitney versus California, is kind of where it gets interesting, because Anita Whitney, the plaintiff in that case, had helped organize a communist rally in California in 1919. And it violated a California act that didn't allow for communist assembly. And the Supreme Court upheld the act, and they basically said that you don't have a First Amendment right to assemble for causes that harm the republic. And that's not the exact term they used, but that was the concept. And In 1919, communism was not a popular thing. This is just the end of the First World War. And so the Supreme Court didn't like that. Now you contrast that with today. And this is why I have Whitney up here. The First Amendment, and you'll see from this next case, DeJong versus Oregon, which comes in 1937, they basically walk that back, and the Supreme Court, and they say, look, even if you don't like the political cause, the First Amendment is politically neutral. And we're not going to get into kind of the right, what's good for the republic. That needs to be worked out by the citizens in the marketplace of ideas, for lack of a better idea, or a better way of saying it. And then this last case, Edwards versus South Carolina, this is kind of a classic way that we think of the First Amendment. And there were 187 African Americans that were protesting a law in South Carolina. They were prosecuted for gathering in that way. And the Supreme Court said, no, that violates the First Amendment. They're allowed to protest, and we're not going to censor this thought. And you go from that decision in 1963 and think back about the Whitney decision in 1919, and the right to protest has been significantly expanded from there. And it leads to the world we're in today, where the goal seems to be for things to be content neutral. Now that is much easier said than done, and we're going to get into some of that right now. And I'll pass the baton to Heather.
Perfect. So there are certain restrictions that the government can levy upon the freedom of speech and assembly, the First Amendment rights. And those are known as the time, place, and manner restrictions. They are not always the easiest to define, and there's many case laws that come down on that come down with very subtle nuances. For example, the 10th Circuit week before last issued a quite lengthy decision on place. And in that case, there was a person who was protesting out on a median in the middle of the street. And sometimes the medians are determined to be public places and sometimes not. And sometimes it depends on what the type of activity is. So we've had decisions from the 10th Circuit that have concluded panhandlers can't stop and stand in the middle of medians and try to solicit money from the motoring public on the medians, because that is dangerous and that is a valid time, place, and manner restriction. But in this case that the 10th Circuit came out with a couple of weeks ago, it was whether someone could post a political sign there. And so you didn't have, and different signs had been posted there. So you have the difference between that human person being there and in causing potential safety hazard, or just a sign. I don't know if it was, I can't remember if it was a political sign, but whatever it was, where there was no safety issue. And the court ruled that, and it reversed the district court, saying that that was not a valid restriction, and said that the median there was appropriate for use. So one of the things we've been seeing recently with the protests are curfew restrictions. Those would be known as time restrictions. And if you recall, when we had the initial protests that began at the end of May, the governor imposed some curfews that people could protest up at the state capitol till a certain time. And I think at 9 o'clock they were required to leave. And those, but to be able to establish those curfew restrictions, there has to be certain requirements that come into place. And we don't have time to discuss all those. But what we want to do is fill you in on what the issues are today, so that when you have those, then you can contact your attorneys, whether it be us or someone else, the city attorneys, the county attorneys, the state attorneys, other people, to figure out what you need to do for that. So time is one of them, and curfew is a subset of that. Another, as I mentioned, is the place. And we've talked about the medians and how that can be done. You also are looking at places like public parks. It gets a little bit different when you're looking into, say, for example, your municipal or county buildings. Those are public places, but they're going to be subject to more allowable restrictions, because you have people coming in and out, you have people doing business, and they can be disruptive, and they can't, protesters can have a right to get their message out in a meaningful way, but they don't have the right to restrict and impinge on other people's restrictions. So be aware of that. The other, the third component is the manner restriction. And as we saw during the protests that occurred in Salt Lake City toward the end of May, and then into the additional protests that have been occurring with respect throughout different municipalities with respect to police, use of force issues, you have seen this distinction between peaceful protests and those that turn violent. Now, behind that, there are decisions that are made at an administrative level as to what, even if something is determined not to be a typical peaceful protest, what they are willing to put up with. And so you have these, for example, you have the people that were painting the district attorney's office red and putting their handprints on that. Is that a peaceful protest? Arguably, it is not, because there's trespassing and there is damage done to property, which is a criminal act. Was there violence in terms of people harming others? It did become harming, breaking the windows. And so there's this whole spectrum along the way as to whether something is peaceful or not. And there are a lot of different components, political components, that go into that as well. So as you're going through the decisions as to what to do, it's really important that administration be in communication with those who are enforcing, generally law enforcement, as to what is the lines are that are being drawn and where those end and the reasons for that. As you can see that, and by what we talked about, just because something doesn't involve gunshots or, for example, years back when there was the what was the name of the movement? The Occupy Wall Street. You had people that were lying down on the tracks trains out in front of our office. That's peaceful, but it can become not peaceful where they're not willing, where they're blocking trains, and then the police officers have to remove them and they can become violent. So in just like a lot of law enforcement contexts, it's very fluid and can change from very quickly. And so it's important that we be able to train, anticipate what those issues are and train on how to do them. So as you can see, there are different situations, and we'll deal with those as we go through. And as the decisions about what to do and how to do it and when to do it are made, it's critical that the right of the protesters to protest is weighed against the public interest. And the public interest includes law enforcement safety. And I think we're seeing a real struggle to define what that is, particularly in our Salt Lake County area recently, and even down into the protests that occurred down in Utah County a couple of months ago. So I think it's interesting when you talk to a lot of people that they think that cities and law enforcement are not favorable to the First Amendment, and lawyers who represent them. I think that we are the most strongly supportive of First Amendment rights, because they are what protect us from tyranny. It just becomes uncomfortable when people disagree about what it is. And as you've seen, that these protests can become very emotional. In the past, we've seen issues on, for example, the right to choose versus the right to life. You see things on use of force more frequently right now. And some can be very offensive to other sides. You've got the Blues Brothers example of the white supremacists that are protesting in the park and flag burning. And it can become very difficult to control emotions, not only of the protesters and then counter protesters that are there, but of people who are involved in determining what the limitations shall be and those enforcing it. So we need to make sure that up front the goal is defined. In any military, I'm a political science major, and in any political conflict or a military conflict, it's critical at the outset to determine what the end goal is and when that is met. And when that is met, then to have an exit strategy for that. And so some of the things we need to be looking at specifically are on use of force and arrests as we go through these. And I think Scott and I probably agree that there are going to be more and more protests. As we see things happening, people become more alert and akin to that. And, you know, Scott and I were talking as we were preparing for this, there are going to be different types of protests. Scott, tell them sort of what we discussed about live protests versus some of the other types.
Yeah, I mean, we are in a brave new world where everyone has a phone, and we'll get into that more, but I think we're going to be seeing things like virtual protests. We're going to see different kinds of Occupy movements, whether it could be occupying computer systems through viruses, things like this. And so we need to start thinking, Heather and I just kind of were chatting about how we need to start thinking prospectively about how technology is going to influence the ability of people to gather, the ability to apply this law and enforce it in virtual forums as well as live forums. So
that gets down to different types of protests that you have. And some are just by virtue of the First Amendment, people are allowed to express themselves in the way that they feel is appropriate, as long as they're not affecting others. So you have the guy down at Temple Square who is the street preacher who is yelling out his religious beliefs. He has the right on the private or on the public property to do that. Now, when it moves into the area that is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that disappears because that is now private property, and the church has the authority and the ability to require him to leave, or else he's trespassing. Protesters, so he doesn't, if he is just alone by himself with his sign yelling out, he doesn't need to have a permit to express his views. Now that becomes a little bit different if now he's setting out amplifying devices, microphones, or maybe a bullhorn. And what if his protests now are affecting others in nearby offices who are trying to conduct business? Or if he's blocking people's access to businesses, that then can prompt the need for him to obtain a permit. Some of the examples are up on the screen that you can see, is if people are blocking traffic or if a street closure is required. Larger rallies tend to require permits more than the street preacher down on the corner, because there is the greater concern of it affecting others in terms of sound, in terms of their ability to get to certain places. And it doesn't have to do with what they're saying, but how that is, implemented. And then the parks and plazas is another area. Some plazas are private. I think the Gallivan Center is a private plaza, but I think the plaza outside of our office is a public one. And so there are going to be different requirements. When we have summer concerts here, sometimes where people come to play music at noon, and they are required to get a permit from the city to play music. Where as over at the Gallivan Center can prevent them from doing that. So it's important to be aware of where those distinctions are. Those really apply generally to the law enforcement because it affects how they're going to be able to go about and what they are going to be able to do. I think these slides up here just talk a little, these points talk a little bit about what we've already discussed in terms of how people, these really are the manner restrictions that are imposed because of how the protest is going to come across. The other important thing to remember is you cannot deny a permit based on the popularity of a certain point of view. The white supremacists have the same right to express their views as people who are promoting equality and justice and social justice issues. Where it can get tricky is where you have these counter protests and the right to have counter protests at the same time. We've seen several counter protests in support of law enforcement and against law enforcement occurring. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you go about regulating those so that safety concerns are ameliorated, but you don't violate people's rights to express themselves in what is a meaningful way, because sometimes the protesters, it is to express that view to the very people that have the opposing points of view, not just the public in general. When you're looking at permits, it's critical that there be waivers for people who truly cannot afford it. And what goes into analyzing whether that is the case and how to apply those is very fact dependent and should be taken on a case-by-case basis. There are, when there are these larger rallies where you have permits and regulation of the areas, there can be real issues that come across with protest zones. We saw an example a couple months ago of, about a month and a half ago, of the protesters protesting law enforcement use of force, a shooting in one of our local municipalities, who were in a public area in a park, and then they moved into the public streets and began into residential neighborhoods and began to affect the residents walking on their property, blocking traffic. And so they didn't really, and still don't even understand the differentiation between the public and the private places and the zones to where you can do that. By they, I mean the protesters. And the public at large, I think, doesn't understand that. And I think one of the things that we could really do a good job as governmental entities is to get out in front of these issues and try to help educate the public about what the First Amendment does cover and the areas and how we're willing to do that, so that we're not trying to, when issues happen, go back and do that and then try to explain things as to how things happen when emotions are high. I don't know how we do that. And I think those are some really important things for administrations to talk about, as how we go about letting people know what is appropriate and what is not. So they, I had a case several years ago where where a temple was opening up, a Salt Lake, or a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day temple was opening up, and the city in which that was occurring had created a protest zone where the protesters were allowed to be. The ACLU ended up representing the protesters in that case, and had filed a motion for a temporary restraining order addressing the free speech zone, because their position is they were not, the protest zone was not in a place where they could be heard in a meaningful way. The protest zone was created across the street from where people who were coming to the open house to view the inside of the new temple were, and they wouldn't be able to hear what the protesters were saying. And they actually were right about that. Now, the municipality was also right in imposing some restrictions as to where they could be, because the people who were attending the viewing of the new temple inside were being bussed in, and then they were getting off the buses on a busy street. And you had safety concerns both for the buses and for the pedestrians getting off the buses and getting into the temple without being accosted by protesters. So there was this tug and pull. And fortunately, the ACLU was great to work with. We were able to negotiate a change in where the zone was, so that the protesters could be in an area where people who were going to the inside were able to make their message heard to those people, but not in a way that blocked them or was overly loud or caused any safety issues. So hopefully, when that is an example of where you have a permit up front and where some of these things can be dealt with. It can be very different when we have protests that are organic and that maybe happen by themselves, or people who don't understand the need to obtain these permits and how they work. And it can be much more difficult, and you don't have the ability up front to conduct these negotiations. So what do we do in those certain circumstances? It's really important to remember, again, that the protesters have the right to be heard and seen by the public at large, and including those who don't share their points of view. They do not have the right to obstruct areas such as traffic. They don't have the right to intimidate people. They don't have the right to walk through other people's private property. And one of the ways that enforcers have created a good medium is to create one side of the street sidewalk for one area of opinion and another for the other. And those are known as some fixed buffer zones. And they occur when you have people who have different and opposing viewpoints, and they want to be able to express those against one another. It's really important to remember that each must be treated equally, or that could be violative of the First Amendment and due process, Fourth and 14th Amendment due process rights. The law enforcement has the right to keep them separated to prevent harm, but they must be able to be heard and seen by others so that they have their message that comes across. One of the other issues that I think you are facing and will continue to face is, when are you allowed to, and how do you go about ending a protest? A protest can be by permit, but it can become violent. And if there is a risk of harm or imminent danger or interference with traffic, despite those, they can be ended. we saw with the protests that started out at the end of May, they started out, I think, as peaceful protests. I knew some people who went down to protest what they, to express their points of view, both sides, and they ended up leaving as it became more and more violent. And law enforcement had to intervene as they became nothing short of a riot. So when a protest becomes a threat to public safety, it's important that the officers be able to articulate the immediate threat to the public. It can't just be something that is foreseeable or possible. It has to be an imminent threat, and it really needs to be documented in police reports. And before making people leave, I was learned myself in preparing to do this, that they need to be given a reasonable opportunity to comply. You can't just tell them because it has become violent that they need to leave. So the slide goes through and tells you a little bit about how to do that and what you can do. Another issue that's really important is the media in terms of covering protests. They are going to be there. And Scott talked a little bit about how cameras are everywhere. And it's important to allow the journalists to be there. They have the equal rights as the protesting members. The key things we want you to take away is you can't just take their notes or their video recordings or their audio recordings because they were there, because they might show something of that may be illegal. You have to secure a warrant to do that. You may be able to seize the camera or the audio recording device for protection so that it can't be altered or eliminated, but to actually view that, there must be a warrant, just like there would be in any type of arrest situation. And it's also important to remember that just because journalists are journalists, they don't have special privileges. They don't have greater rights than the protesters. So they have to abide by the very same rules. They have the ability to photograph or record what's going on. There is an exception if, for example, officers are rehearsing some type of an implementation of a plan that could interfere with their ability to carry that out, then they can be excluded from that. But if it's in public view, they are entitled to record that, and they can't just automatically come in and confiscate things because there is law enforcement action involved. So those are some of the nuts and bolts issues of what to do in protests, and there's just no way for us to cover every bit of that. So like we said, if you have those questions that come up, Scott and I have our cell phones that are available, and you can call us at any time and we can help you walk through those issues. And now I want to turn it back over to Scott so he can talk a little bit more about the fundamentals of how you go about doing some of the nuts and bolts and the policy decisions that are behind that.
So you can see from this screen that there are kind of 5 topics that we want to talk about that we're confronting right now and that are frankly pretty new and kind of evolving. And just some considerations that we want everyone to think through on these topics. So first of all, with social media, everyone has a camera. I think that's become a cliche already. But what that really means is that everyone has a platform, and we do not have any control over the presentation that someone who posts something up on their personal Twitter account or their personal YouTube channel, how they'll present it, what context they'll give or omit. I think everyone can think of a time in their life, whether in their public life or their private life, when they felt wronged because something was taken out of context. Even just an exchange you may have with someone in your family. Well, you need the full context of why I said that to so-and-so, our neighbor across the street or whatnot. And then of course, we don't control the reaction. And what is really amplified in these times is the speed with which this process occurs. And that really puts a priority on our training, what training we're giving, and then whether or not we're following the proper training. And then, of course, on our professionalism. And this gets down to just the very, very nitty gritty. The appearance of our public officials that are speaking to the press, the appearance of our officers when they are dealing with a protest, what the reactions are of people. And then this can be included with, say, if there's a city administrator that's going on to comments on KSL and making comments and things like this. And just organizationally, what's the presentation? Who is the spokesperson for the organization? Does the organization know that down to the frontline workers like the police officers? So let's talk about the media environment, because that environment has changed quite a bit. I'm 43. When I was a kid, there were 4 news outlets, the 3 major channels, and then PBS. And I want to show you a clip. This is Tom Friedman. He's a columnist for the New York Times. He's written a lot of books. He's a big public voice. And he is giving what's called a talk at Google. And if you go on YouTube and type in talks at Google, Tom Friedman, this will come up. And I want to show you just a very brief clip and then talk about it.
We had no audio from that clip.
On the video, yeah, I just saw that. Thanks for telling me. Let's see. Let's try this. Can you hear it now?
No.
Okay.
Maybe you can summarize.
That is too bad. I'll summarize it then. Tom Friedman is talking about a book that he wrote maybe 6 or 7 years ago called Thank You for Being Late. And he's talking about how he parks his car when he goes into work from his home in Maryland to Washington, D.C. in a parking garage. And as he was leaving the parking garage, the attendant took his money and then said, "Hey, I know who you are. I read your column. I like some of it. I don't like other parts of it." And Tom Friedman talks about how this made him kind of cringe and so forth. And he does it, more humorously and eloquently than I'm doing. But the next day, he comes and sees the same parking attendant. And the parking attendant tells him, "Not only do I read your column, I have my own blog." And this parking attendant happened to be an Ethiopian national. And so his blog was dedicated to Ethiopian politics and whatnot. But Tom Friedman says in this clip, he said, "I had this realization." He says, "Oh my gosh, I'm competing with the parking attendant." And that's what we're seeing in media these days is if you're Tom Friedman and you get the New York Times job, you no longer have a monopoly on media content. Your competition is every person with a cell phone, every person with a Twitter account, every person with a blog. And so what does that lead to? Well, it leads to increased sensationalism. And it leads to a lowest common denominator because people are focused on clicks. And I know that from personal experience. I was at a lunch about 2 weeks ago with a director of one of the largest media companies here in Utah. And he was walking me through how they know based on what I click on the site, how long I'm there, what leads me there. Did I come from Google? Did I come from another part of the site? Did I type it in? Did I come from some other link? And they also know that most people stay on their site on something they click on for less than 3 seconds. So the sensationalism comes from the hook that they have to give to get you to click for 3 seconds so that an ad can come up, and that ad is what generates the revenue. And so it's no longer the case that, like when I was a kid, that you would see these bland article headlines that cited a fact and a big discussion about a fact when you read that article because you're actually flipping a newspaper page. That no longer happens. People's attention span is so short that it leads to this sensationalism. Now, that isn't necessarily all bad, because we tend to think when we have bad news coverage or coverage that we don't think gets the whole picture, that, you know, and look, Heather and I are no different, right? When we lose a case, but we have this thought like, oh my gosh, the world is coming down on us. When in reality, in the news, Donald Trump is going to tweet something in the next hour that is going to take over the news cycle. And then someone else is going to tweet something about Donald Trump, and the news cycle is going to move on quicker. That doesn't mean that there isn't some staying power, but it impacts how people view protests and how they view our presentation and how we're doing our job. I have that last bullet point, analytics, because we are in a world where all of this stuff is monetized by analyzing how persuasive it is to us. And I've actually done some work on that with judges, if anyone's interested, but you should know that these stories are being analyzed to maximize profit, not to ensure that the content is given the proper context that it needs. Another critical concern is public safety. And Heather's touched on the law of that, but I want to just introduce the idea of who do we think of needs to be protected, and it's everyone. And that includes the people who don't like each other. It includes the protesters. It includes counter protesters. It includes the inhabitants of the area that's being protested, business owners, families, children. It also includes police and government workers. And certainly those people, you know, in the municipal environment, those are our friends. Those are the people who protect this very right that we hold sacred. And the issue, I think, is captured in one of my favorite books, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which is about mob mentality in marketplaces. And it was printed over 100 years ago. But I love this quote: men, it has been said, think in herds. They'll go mad in herds, but they only recover their senses slowly. And that is what our officers are dealing with in these frontline things, is a madness that is amplified by emotion and spreads like wildfire and slows down at a much lower rate. And these other issues, weapons, it can be tough to know who's weaponized at a protest. Weapons can be created at protest. A tree branch that's broken can become a weapon. And our officers need to be prepared to deal with it in the moment.
Yeah, and if I could interject, Scott and I did a lot of training on open carry, which is permitted under Utah law and uses a lot of people as a protest and form of expression. And so when you look at that right to open carry, be very careful when you're dealing with that, because there are all sorts of rights that attach to that.
Yeah.
As well.
And interestingly, Heather and I did that presentation. We'd be happy to come do it if you'd like, but we did that kind of it seemed to be a hot issue about 5 years ago. And the YouTube videos that we gathered would have one person. So you'd have an officer dealing with one person walking around with a gun. That unfortunately is no longer the environment, because now you can have a protest, as Heather said, with 95% of people who are trying to go earnestly express a First Amendment point of view without being violent. But intermixed in that group can be people who make it dangerous for officers, for the other protesters, and everyone else. And we all know that, you know, weapons can be concealed in these things, and that really puts a premium on the training for officers and our support of them. Officer safety, just some things to think through when we think there might be a protest, or when we see it coming on Twitter. Do we have an adequate number of officers? Are they adequately equipped to deal with this? Do they have the support of the whole municipal structure? And that can be tough, because officers can make mistakes. Officers can intentionally do wrong things. But do we have good communication from frontline officers that are going to be enforcing time, place, and manner restrictions through the city administration that's going to have to be out front answering for that? And are we on the same page? Training, I think, is a really interesting one. We've seen an increased emphasis, I would say, long before these protests, on de-escalation. I've seen that, I would say, for the last 10 years. And I think Utah has been at the forefront of that. And that kudos to you folks, because that's generally you looking forward and seeing that this is really important. But I do think we have to ask ourselves, in light of kind of these changing circumstances, do we have enough training? And is there enough training specifically to what people deal with in protests? And de-escalation in a protest looks a lot different than de-escalation at responding to a domestic violence. Do we have training on crowd control? And do we have enough training? In Utah, you've got officers go through post, and then they have 40 hours of training a year. That 40 hours, that's a lot of hours, but it's split between a lot of things. And one thing that we have to consider is, not only is it enough for them to do their job well, but is it the right kind of training and enough for us to present to the public well, to explain how we've trained to do this? Protestor safety, we're charged, and especially in the court of public opinion, with protecting protesters. And do we have plans and restrictions? And the start to finish, I think, is really important, because, as Heather said, with regard to giving people time to disperse and making sure that they can do that in a safe way. And again, the public presentation of how we've done that is really important. Best practices. I had a cousin that played college basketball many years ago for Rick Majerus up at the University of Utah. And when I talked to him about what he loved about Majerus, he said that if you walked into the University of Utah basketball department and asked the receptionist how they defended a pick and roll or a screen, the receptionist knew. And he said that's what was great about Majerus, is everyone in the organization was on the same page. And I think that is really critical, and we need to work towards that. We need robust and continual training that relates to these very specific issues: anger management, de-escalation, and crowd control. And I just ask you to think about a lesson that Dwight Eisenhower learned when he was 11 years old. And what happened was he had done something wrong on Halloween, and his mother would not let him go trick-or-treating. And Dwight had a hot temper. He ran hot, particularly at 11, and particularly when he couldn't go, gather hordes of candy. And so he stormed up to his room, punched some walls, broke some things. And a few minutes later, his mother came up, and she read to him a scripture from Proverbs. It's Proverbs 16:32. And Dwight Eisenhower was not a religious person. And he told a biographer when he was in his later years, he said, I was never a religious person, but that Halloween shaped my entire life. It was the most important lesson of my life. And in Proverbs 32, I'll just read it to you for kicks and giggles here. It says, his mother told him, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. And so it was just about controlling his anger. And you think about how that lesson shaped Dwight Eisenhower into a person that would lead the charge in Europe in World War II and then would lead our country. I think it's a good reminder to our officers that it's really important to control your temper. And it's easy to say in the comfort of a conference room. I'll be the first to admit it's really easy for me to stand here and preach it. It's a lot harder when someone is waving a brick at you or spitting in your face or shouting epithets, but it pays incredibly significant dividends. And I'll just tell you one story about the dividends that they do pay, because I think that you as municipalities do a fantastic job. And I really do firmly believe, having conversed with lawyers across the country about this, that Utah really does lead out in this. And I just want to tell you a quick story. I have a brother-in-law that's in the FBI in Sacramento, and he's been in the FBI for 18 years. So he's not a newbie, and he was on SWAT for about 12 years. So he's done all kinds of crowd control. He's done all kinds of SWAT exercises and so forth. And we were talking about these protests, and I was just lamenting how difficult it is for the officers and how I think they do a really good job and don't get enough credit oftentimes for how good a job they do. And his response was, "You're not kidding." And he told me there are lots of officers that have become FBI agents that he has worked with. And he said, no one is better at controlling their temper than the guys that did local law enforcement. And my brother-in-law didn't do that. He was a lawyer and then went to the FBI. But he said these guys and women that have done local law enforcement and have dealt with people that are high on drugs, people that are having domestic violence issues, these really intense things, do a fantastic job at keeping their temper. And this is just a reminder that it's not all bad news. I think things are going well. There are places that we can improve. There are things we need to keep thinking of as technology evolves, and particularly with COVID, which we haven't talked about a ton. But where COVID comes in is it safe to even assemble? And can government step in the name of public safety? In the broad picture, is yes. But when do we do that? And how do we assess it? And how do we document what data we are relying on? And so I'll close with two things. The reason the data we rely on for a public safety issue like COVID is important has been illustrated by the Big Ten in their football decision. The Pac-12 and Big Ten have canceled football. The Pac-12 has basically used a protocol based on its doctors. They published it. They said, these are the metrics we need to meet before we can play again. And until we meet them, we can't do it. And the Pac-12 has received relatively little blowback for that because they're relying on scientific data. And that scientific data is tough. I mean, I was giving my brother a hard time over the weekend because, Fauci, the WHO, these people are changing all the time. And that's not a discredit to them. We're dealing with an emerging threat in COVID that we don't understand. So the data is going to change. But we need to rely on data. And the reason the Big Ten has gotten in so much trouble, at least in the court of public opinion, is because they have changed their public data that they're relying on. They have not relied on doctors to the same extent, the same kind of protocols, and they seem to just be bouncing all over the place. And of course, that looks like it's result-driven, not data-driven. And decisions we make about protests and if there's a public safety concern, with something like COVID, another virus, or anything of the like. Wildfires could be an example, or if people were trying to gather while we're clearing trees based on this windstorm could be another example. But our decisions need to be data driven, and that's the best way to not appear as if they're content driven. The last story I'll leave you with is a story from Ethiopia, because I've actually been involved in a protest in Ethiopia, and it was terrifying. And it's not what's going on here. That's what we don't want to have happen, is what I experienced in 2005. And I graduated from law school, and my law school gift to myself was a 2-week jaunt in Ethiopia before the ceremony and before I got, a real job back here at Snow Christensen and Martineau. And I happened to meet up. I had no idea that they were having elections when I flew over there. And I happened to meet up with a friend who was working for Human Rights Watch monitoring the elections. And so I helped him monitor the elections. And that involved covering a protest in the biggest square in the capital, Addis Ababa. There was an estimate that there were at least 500,000 people in the square. There were no police officers. And to just tell a brief, make this short, we had a moment where the protest turned from a bunch of people chanting for the rival, not the incumbent, but the person seeking to take over the presidency, to when the crowd turned on us. And luckily there was a reporter from Reuters International that had an SUV, and it looked worse than Charlottesville driving out of that place. I thought they were going to throw over the van, but there was no police presence. There were several fatalities of protesters, not related to us, but we just learned later that day. And so the police and municipalities perform a critical function here in allowing all citizens, no matter their point of view, to express a point of view in a peaceful way. We salute you for that. This isn't what happens in many, many places in the world, and I've experienced that. And the goal is to keep letting people in peaceful ways express their opinions. That's the marketplace of ideas. That is the fundamental job of the First Amendment. Heather and I want to help you do that to the best we can, but we think you're doing a fantastic job. And now we'll open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate that presentation there, Scott. Questions. So talking about people's ability to film. One of the trends that we're seeing is we have people will walk in off the street with a camera. They may be live streaming. They may post it to their YouTube account, and they walk in and basically are looking for a confrontation in many cases. How does that apply to the First Amendment, and how can our local governments respond to that?
They have the right to do that if they are in a public place, as long as they are not infringing upon others' safety or ability to get where they're going. It can be very frustrating when you're trying to do your job. In the training that Scott and I did on the open carry, that's what people were doing. They were open carrying and trying to incite law enforcement into poor behavior while filming it. And the law enforcement officers responded beautifully and just said, yeah, you can record me, no problem. And, I think one way to help remember that if they're not doing it, Scott mentioned someone else is probably doing it anyway. I know Ken Wallentine has said for years, someone is recording you somewhere. And that is more the case now than ever. So hopefully, Scott, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think what's changed since Heather and I did that presentation 5 years ago is the live stream component with Facebook Live and YouTube and so forth. And so one part of that I think is really critical is that because it could be live streamed, you could have it out there on Twitter, moments later. And so I think if you see someone that's doing that, you expect it in a protest, but if someone, say, walks into a public building and is doing that, I think you need to let the organization know, so it goes up the ladder, so people can be prepared in case there's, in case all of a sudden a firestorm erupts over something that's shown. And so that starts with training and just saying to people, look, if someone comes in with a video, please let your supervisor know so we can address it as quickly as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. We have a couple of questions here. What about public meetings? If somebody comes in and starts using foul language or insulting people in the crowd, is there a way to limit that, or is that free speech?
Well, that's an excellent question. I tend to think it is free speech, but I think you can ask them to be polite and have the best presentation by the public officials. I think there's a line that can be drawn on that, but it's kind of a case by case basis. And if it's over the top offensive, I think you can have them leave. But when I've seen that, I haven't seen that happen, say, at a city council meeting, but I've seen that happen with a number of speakers. This seems to be happening all the time in academia. So when someone who doesn't have a point of view that is, liked on a campus, they get shouted down and so forth. And what's critical, because I've seen officers remove those folks from rooms, is how the officer acts. And usually, as long as they're gentle and they're not rude, they can get them out. And what I've noticed is that even with people where the speaker is not saying something that most people like, they don't like the person who's using profanity, who's interrupting. The other thing I would encourage at city council meetings, for example, is a time limit. So, if you let public commenters have just a time limit, that can be an easy way, if they get out of hand and they're being rude and offensive, to just end it because they've only got a minute to speak or so forth. So I like a short time limit with an ability to petition for a longer time, but that lets you filter out if people are just going to use it as some kind of stump to be profane and rude.
I think Scott nailed it on the head with the time limit. That's how I have actually seen actual problems resolved. The other is they cannot incite immediate violence or problems like that. So I think they have the right to be offensive. They have the right probably to be profane. But if they are inciting violence, they do not have the right to do that and can be removed.
Great. That was really my follow-up question is can you limit people based on time and those types of things?
As long as you're doing so across the board.
Right. So if you enact just that everyone has a time limit, whether it's, Mother Teresa or, the most foul person, they're all limited to 1 minute or a minute and a half or something.
Yeah.
And one thing that I've seen, and I just like to get your opinion on this, I've seen a lot of our member organizations around the state will have something on the agenda, maybe a handout that goes with it, with the agenda that kind of gives those rules and says you have 1 minute or 3 minutes or something like that. Would you think that would be appropriate?
Yeah, it depends on what it would say, but as long as it's content neutral and it sticks to explaining the rules, and I think that would be great.
Agreed.
Could you maybe talk a little bit, going back to these First Amendment audits where people come in and they start taking video? Could you talk about what is a public place? Take, for example, a city hall that has a police station there. Does that First Amendment right extend throughout the entire public building, or are there areas where you can limit people from filming or wandering through our halls?
So I think you start at the basic premise is that all government-owned property is a public space. Now, you get down to whether there are certain aspects of that place that allowing complete public and open access would start compromising safety, access, interrupting others. And so you kind of work backwards from, you start from the blank slate that if it's a government-owned facility, a park, a building, it is a public place. But then you start looking at how is it impacting things. And for example, a police station is going to be treated differently than the foyer of City Hall.
A place, let's take a private office of an employee. Is there a reasonable anticipation of privacy in an office? And thinking of various places, obviously somebody would not be able to film inside of a restroom or a changing room or somewhere like that. But is there a way that an organization could limit that, maybe through signage or something like that?
Right. I don't think that the public has a right to come back into the mayor's office and shout and hold signs and drag people through the entire office area.
Or film.
Or film, yeah, for that matter. So do you want to add to that, Scott?
No, my thought is if it interferes with someone's ability to do their job. So it's one thing to do it in a lobby, but it's another thing to be looking over someone's shoulder, trying to film them doing their job, or in any other office. So I think that is a line that you can draw. I do think one of the really important things is the explanation, though, because a lot of time, like you said, with the live streaming, these people are coming in looking for a fight, and so they've already got the video. And if the explanation is inadequate, then it can achieve the desired result. And so I think, explaining to people explaining to employees what's allowed, what's not allowed. If you see something that's not allowed, this is who you call and they will deal with it. And then that individual or group of individuals knows how to explain it to the person who's trying to basically entrap them on a video. That's probably the best way to handle it.
That's a great suggestion by Scott, because then you have one person or two or three people, key people, who know what is required and expected, and you're not relying and putting someone who doesn't have all that information in a poor spot where they're, don't know what to do, and they're afraid because they don't want to do something wrong.
And the explanation can be, look, and it should include the component, this is the area where this is allowed. You are allowed to do this in the lobby, but we can't have you do it here because we've got 4 or 5 people that are working and it's interfering with their ability to, process permits for use of, for buying land or what have you.
Great. And as I've talked with members about this, my recommendation is put signage up that says employees only in this area, because some of these folks going around doing these audits, they'll go anywhere that they can.
One example that would be a valid time, place, and manner restriction would be you don't get to go back into the inner offices. But if someone who wants to protest the mayor and the mayor's decision can stand outside the front area of the mayor's offices and do that.
Very good. Very good. And I would just recommend people take a look at some of these videos and just see the methods that these folks are using, because they're really going in looking for a fight. And I think the best thing that we can do is not give it to them. Be pleasant and say, yeah, you've got a right to film all you want. And when they have pleasant people there, they'll probably go on to somebody else looking for some clicks. We do have a question about a copy of the presentation. Is that something you'd make available for people that we can distribute?
Yeah, we'll put it on our website. And then if you just go to scmlaw.com, there's an area where we have things that are posted, case law updates, presentations that are given, and we'll put it there so you can access it from our website.
Can probably email it to him.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just with our technical difficulties to start with, didn't get much of a chance to introduce these two. We really appreciate their time and the time they've taken to put this presentation together for us. Scott and Heather defended us on countless number of different claims, from the constitutional to law enforcement to various different things, and we appreciate their support and their great knowledge in these areas. Final word, Scott and Heather.
Thank you so much for all you are doing. This is, and you hear it all the time, these are challenging times. They really are difficult times, and you are on the front lines, and we so much admire and appreciate you.
And please don't hesitate to call us on our cell phones. We are very interested in this stuff. We want to help you out. And if you can't reach Heather, give me a call. If you can't reach me, give Heather a call. Don't be shy. If you've got, we're happy to work through questions on the fly because we know this is rapidly evolving.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate that information, folks. We will be, this will be up on our YouTube channel, and should post up there pretty quick. It takes a few minutes to render after we get done, but you can go back and share this with other members of your organization, and if they're interested in this. Thank you once again, Scott and Heather. We appreciate your time, and everybody go out and have a safe day.
You as well. Take care.